What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my Week 3 wide receiver start sits. So breaking down all 16 Week 3 matchups, talking about every single fantasy relevant wide receiver, and then listing them as either a start, a fringe option, or a sit. The starts are going to be the wide receivers you would trust playing as your wide receiver 1, your wide receiver 2. The fringe options, these are more of your flex plays. You know, they're not great in your lineup, but they're certainly playable. And then sits, obviously players that you would prefer to keep on your bench. I've already gone through my running back start sit video. Check that one out if you haven't seen it already. Any questions, drop them down below. But let's just dive right into the Thursday night matchup here. And we have the Patriots taking on the Jets. And at this point, you know, none of these Patriots wide receivers are coming even close to being playable. Demario Douglas is not even being targeted. Jalen Polk got into the end zone. I think he's the guy that has some juice long-term rest of season. But at this point, all these dudes are very, very firm sits. Looking at the Jets here, I really like Garrett Wilson as a buy low. I talked about him in my trade target video. He's been fine through 2 weeks, but I do think we're going to get some much better games moving forward. So I like him as a start, going to be sitting Allen Lazard and Mike Williams. I feel like that big week 1 from Lazard, that kind of definitely seems like it's going to be a one-off here. Now looking at the Giants-Browns matchup, the Sunday slate, Malik Neighbors is coming off of a monster week 2. He was solid in week 1. He went out week 2, just commanded an insane amount of volume. I've been very high on Neighbors. I know the offensive situation isn't great. I know this is a bad matchup, but Malik Neighbors is so talented. I think he's going to be able to overcome it, both in this matchup and just rest of season. So I like Neighbors as a start. Wan'Dale Robinson, believe he got into the end zone week 2, had a lot of volume week 1. In this specific spot, it's a tough matchup. I think it seems a little bit fluky in terms of his production, so he's going to be a sit. Also sitting Darius Slayton. Then looking at the Browns here, I actually had to, take some thought here with Amari Cooper because coming into the season, I think most people would have expected him to be a solid start. At worst, he's like a fringe option, wide receiver 3. The first 2 weeks have not been great. Deshaun Watson not playing at a super high level. That's part of the problem. We've also seen Cooper just have a couple of costly drops. Week 1, he dropped what should have been a touchdown. Week 2, a deeper pass. Wasn't a super easy play, but a play where you'd expect a wide receiver of Amari Cooper's caliber, to make. So he's had a couple fumbles here in terms of, just drops. I'm still going to list him as a fringe option, and a big part of it is just due to the matchup. If this was a tough matchup where I thought the Browns offense was just going to be stifled, then I'd probably have him as a sit. But I do think they're going to be able to put up some points here against the Giants. So I'm still sticking with Amari Cooper here as a fringe play. Jerry Jeudy, Elijah Moore, not coming off of bad games, but I just don't trust this passing attack. And I do think Amari Cooper should be the number 1 there. So really no interest in Jeudy and Moore as like the number 2 and the number 3 options. Now looking at the Bears-Colts matchup, for the Bears, DJ Moore, a fine game. This Bears offense just kind of continues to struggle here. I'm still sticking strong on DJ Moore as a start. I think it's only going to go up from here. And then when we're looking at Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze, both guys dealing with injuries, I was actually surprised that Keenan Allen was the one who sat out and Rome Odunze played. I thought it was going to be the flip of that. So for Keenan Allen, if he's still banged up, it's tough to fully trust him, especially with the fact that this Bears offense is struggling, both through the air and on the ground. And then for Rome Odunze, he kind of had his shot, even though he was banged up with Keenan Allen out in week 2. Didn't really make the most of it. He's like a second half play at this point. Now looking at the Colts, I actually have all these wide receivers as sits. Seems kind of crazy, but Pittman, Pierce, A.D. Mitchell, Josh Downs. Through 2 weeks, Michael Pittman has been a non-factor in this offense. I talked about it heading into the year. I don't think his skill set lines up with Anthony Richardson. I definitely didn't think it would be this bad, but it's been rough through 2 weeks. Alec Pierce has been the guy who's producing, so maybe you make the argument that he should be a fringe play. For me, he's like having these big plays. He's getting into the end zone. From what we've seen from him early on in his career, I don't think this production is sustainable. Hopefully we get Josh Downs back this week, I guess just in terms of like the overall ceiling of this offense. A.D. Mitchell has gotten open. He's had some opportunities to make some plays. He's had some drops. He's also been missed by Anthony Richardson. So at this point, I'm kind of fading this entire Colts wide receiver room, at least in this matchup against the Bears. Bears have a solid defense. They held pretty much all the Texans pass catching weapons in check, I guess with the exception of Nico Collins, who's just dominant at this point, but definitely fading that Colts wide receiver room. Then looking at the Texans Vikings matchup here, for the Texans, I'm actually still listing Nico Collins, Stephon Diggs, and Tank Dell as starts. Obviously, Nico Collins is like the no-brainer here, where He's a top 12 guy, top 10 guy rest of season. He's been ultra impressive, especially considering the wide receiver competition he does have. Stephon Diggs, he had the big week 1. A lot of it was due to getting into the end zone. Week 2, nothing crazy. Tank Dell has definitely kind of flopped in back-to-back weeks. Might be controversial. I'm still trusting him as a start here. He was pretty much one drop away from the Sunday night game from his stat line looking very, very different. That could have been a touchdown, a long touchdown for Tank Dell. He screwed it up. That's on him. But he's still, 4 targets, nothing crazy, but they're getting him involved on the ground. The route participation has been there, which was the concern for me. 85% route participation. It was the exact same as Stephon Diggs. Him and Diggs are kind of in the same range in terms of their targets. And I think with Tank Dell, it's just, 2 weeks into the season, he proved last year he's talented. We know this is a good offense. Paired with CJ Stroud, I still think he's reliable moving forward. I think he's a great buy low if people are panicking after 2 down weeks. I think there are going to be much better games ahead here for Tank Dell. Then looking at the Vikings, Jefferson, if he's playing, which it seems like he is trending towards doing that, he's obviously going to be a strong start for you. We saw Jalen Naylor get into the end zone. I don't think he's playable. Jordan Addison dealing with an ankle injury. Would prefer to see him log a decent game before I want to throw him into my lineup. So Addison's going to be a sit. I will say, though, long term for Jordan Addison, I think coming into the year, there was definitely concern of can he produce, with Kirk Cousins gone, if Justin Jefferson's the clear number 1. I feel like Sam Darnold has looked good enough. This passing attack has looked good enough where there should be some optimism for Jordan Addison moving forward. Now, looking at the Eagles-Saints matchup, for the Eagles here, it looks like A.J. Brown is likely going to miss at least 1 more week here. He talked about how he was going to miss a couple of games. This would be the second one that he'd miss. So Devonta Smith, obviously a very, very strong start. Had a great game with A.J. Brown out of the lineup. With Brown injured, Devonta Smith definitely now comes with some weekly upside. He's no longer a floor wide receiver 2 play. Probably someone who I'll have in my top 12 rankings this week. And then for the Saints, Chris Olave is a start. I think he's a really strong buy low. Had a dud week 1, a fine week 2. The way the Saints offense has looked, I do believe Chris Olave is going to be a great option rest of season. And then Rashid Shaheed, I definitely get the argument if you want him as a start. He's been a monster to start off the season. Week 1, 3 for 73 and a touchdown. Week 2, 4 for 96 and a touchdown. He has had 59 and 70-yard touchdowns. I guess my concern here with Rashid Shaheed is, can we bank on this weekly explosive play, or can we bank on it, more often than not? He's done it in back-to-back weeks. If he somehow goes out and has another big week 3, I will have no choice but to list him as a start. I just think the floor still feels a little bit sketchy because if he's not hitting on one of those bombs, the production's probably not going to be there, but who knows? Maybe the Saints offense just continues rolling. He has another big game, and then I'll definitely give him his respect heading into week 4. Now let's take a look at the Chargers-Steelers matchup here. For the Chargers, I have all these wide receivers as sits. This is a pretty tough matchup against the very, very good Pittsburgh Steelers defense. Ladd McConkey had a decent week 1, didn't do much in week 2. We saw Quentin Johnston have a huge week 2, someone who's somewhat interesting moving forward. But until we get some more clear answers on the guys we want to play within this offense, I'm just going to be sitting all these wide receivers. And then for the Steelers, George Pickens coming off a pretty disappointing week 2, but he kind of got unlucky. I think he was 2 for 29. He drew the Pat Surtain matchup, which was tough. But Pickens had a bunch of plays called back. He had an amazing throw from Justin Fields, truly one of the best throws of the season from Fields, called back on a hold. He had a touchdown called back from an offensive PI that I think they said they didn't really like the call on. And then he also drew a deep pass interference. So he was finding some success, just kind of got unlucky with the calls. So Pickens, I think he's a fringe option. The overall ceiling of this offense is very low at this point. This is definitely a solid Chargers defense, but I do think Pickens feels they have the connection. He's going to be somewhat heavily targeted, and he does have that big playability. So more of a mid to high end wide receiver 3 play. Now let's take a look at the Broncos taking on the Buccaneers. And for the Broncos, this isn't too tough. I mean, I don't really want to be playing literally a single person within this offense. Courtland Sutton, I do think could be playable later on in the season once Bo Nix kind of improves, but through 2 weeks, it has been rough. I don't want anything to do with this Broncos offense. Then for the Buccaneers here, I really liked Chris Godwin heading into the season. I thought him and Mike Evans were going to even out their production. Through 2 weeks, Chris Godwin looks fantastic. He's had 2 very impressive games. Mike Evans didn't have a huge week 2 after a big week 1, Both these guys are very strong starts. And then Jalen McMillan, their wide receiver 3, going to be sitting him. Tough to see him, kind of becoming a reliable, playable option unless one of those top 2 go down. In the next game, we have the Packers taking on the Titans. And for the Packers, I'm going to be assuming that Jordan Love is returning for this game. Seemed like there was a shot he could have played last week. We'll see if he plays here. If Jordan Love is playing, I like Jaden Reed as a start. Definitely seems like their top option. And then I'd be sitting Romeo Doubs, Christian Watson, and Dontavian Wicks. Now, if this is Malik Willis once again, I'd probably have Jaden Reed more as a fringe option, still sitting the other 3. I don't think we have the complete clear picture of what this wide receiver room is going to look like. I know Christian Watson had a goose egg in week 2. Dobbs played well. I still think we need a couple more games with Jordan Love as the quarterback to really figure out what we're looking at here. Because for Christian Watson, he's not going to be a high volume guy. He's going to be someone who can win on big plays, be an explosive option. So him, getting into the end zone week 1, then doing nothing week 2, I'm not burying him because of that. Obviously, it's not looking great. Right now, I'd probably rank these guys like Jaden Reed 1, maybe Romeo Doubs 2, but the ceiling's just not there, and then Watson 3. But I still think there could be some shakeup. So hopefully we get Jordan Love back and we get some more answers with this wide receiver room. And then for the Titans, I have Calvin Ridley as a fringe option here. He's coming off a great week 2 performance. I just have some overall concerns here with this Titans offense. Will Levis has looked pretty suspect through 2 weeks here. We just saw this Packers defense give Anthony Richardson a lot of fits. Not sure how confident I am in Will Levis this week. So Ridley, more of like a mid to high end wide receiver 3 play. Going to be sitting D-Hop, still not playing a full starter workload, still kind of working his way back. So we'll see what his usage looks like here in week 3. Now looking at the Panthers Raiders matchup here, I feel like it's pretty clear there's only one wide receiver you want. Starting off here with the Panthers, sitting Deontay Johnson, sitting Adam Thielen, sitting Xavier Legette. I will say though, Bryce Young getting benched, Andy Dalton coming in, we're at least going to get some answers when it comes to this offense. Now, if Andy Dalton comes in and just looks terrible, the offense looks like it's the same unit we saw in week 1 and week 2, then we can pretty much just bury all these dudes, at least for the foreseeable future. On the other hand, maybe Andy Dalton comes in and plays somewhat well, at least well enough to support some of these weapons. We kind of saw it, I think, last year. Dalton came in, played a game, actually had a little bit of a spark within that offense. Not that they were a top tier unit, but they were at least better than a dead last in the NFL. So that gives me some hope for a guy like Deontay Johnson, maybe a guy like Xavier Legette for some sort of a rookie breakout. But here, the first week with Dalton, definitely going to be sitting all these dudes. And then for the Raiders, like I said, Devontae coming off a big game. He's the one guy in this matchup that you actually want to be playing in your fantasy lineups. Now we're going to have the Dolphins taking on the Seahawks. And for the Dolphins here, Tyreek Hill, even with no Tua, it's tough, but he's still a locked-in wide receiver 1. The tough guy here was Jalen Waddle. I really did consider between a start and a fringe option because Waddle has kind of been the odd man out when Tua has missed time. A lot of those touches are going to Tyreek Hill. He's getting, the quick, the important looks. They want to get the ball in his hands. And without that reliable quarterback play, Waddle has been the guy who's kind of suffered. So I went back and forth. I ended up going with a start. I guess we'll just wait and see how this week 3 looks for the Dolphins. And then for the Seahawks here, starting DK Metcalf, starting JSN, sitting Tyler Lockett. We kind of had the reverse of what happened in week 1, where Tyler Lockett was the only playable guy in week 1. Week 2, DK Metcalf goes out, has a monster game. We pretty much saw a breakout performance here from JSN, commanded 16 targets, caught 12 of those for 117 yards. He is getting the wide receiver 2 snaps, 92% route participation, more than Tyler Lockett, just a couple behind DK Metcalf here. So I like JSN. He was a fun prospect. Looks like he's finally emerging as a top 2 wide receiver within this offense. So I like JSN here as a start. And then sitting Tyler Lockett at this point just kind of looks like the third option. Now in a pretty fun matchup, we have the Lions taking on the Cardinals. And for the Lions here, obviously you're firing up Amon-Ra St. Brown as long as he's healthy. Had a nice bounce back after a down week 1. And then for Jameson Williams, I'm actually considering him a start. In my last week's start sit video, I talked about how he had a big game. The question was, is he just going to be a big play guy who has a few boom games, or can he actually rack up some consistency? The volume looked good once again here in week 2. Now, there was, a lot of opportunities to go around. I think Jared Goff had over 50 pass attempts, but JMO was number 2, right? Sam Laporta was a complete non-factor. He's been pretty much a non-factor through 2 weeks. Through 2 weeks, JMO has been a top 2 guy in this offense. So I like him as a start here. Think it's an interesting matchup against this Cardinals defense. So I'm rolling with both Amon-Ra and Jameson Williams as starts. Now, looking at the Cardinals here, we had some people freaking out over Marvin Harrison Jr.'s week 1. Hopefully you saw my, time to panic video. I was not worried about Marvin Harrison Jr. It was his first NFL game. I wasn't overreacting here. He goes out, just has a monster start. I think like 4 for 130 plus yards, 2 touchdowns. He did it all within like the first few minutes, and then was pretty much like done for the day. But that was still enough to give you a monster fantasy performance. So good Marvin Harrison Jr. bounced back. Should be a fun option moving forward. He's definitely going to be a start. And then sitting Michael Wilson and Greg Dortch. Now looking at a pretty competitive matchup here between the Ravens and the Cowboys. For the Ravens, I like Zay Flowers as a start, like a back-end wide receiver 2 option. Solid game in week 2. And then sitting Rashad Bateman, they're wide receiver 2, but just not a super playable guy. And then for the Cowboys here, obviously you're firing up CeeDee Lamb. I think this wide receiver 2 spot is somewhat interesting. Jalen Tolbert actually had a pretty decent week 2. Brandon Cooks was the better option week 1. I think at this point, you definitely want to fade that wide receiver 2 spot, but maybe one of these dudes could kind of emerge as being playable moving forward. Now we're going to have the Niners taking on the Rams, and both these teams have kind of been hit hard with injury to some of their skill position guys. For the Rams, pretty much all across the board. But for the Niners here, Debo's out. I talked about Brandon Ayuk as a buy low before we knew about the Debo injury, so I'm still in on Ayuk. A solid start, definitely a more reliable option now that he's not competing with both Debo and Kittle as pass catching weapons. Juwan Jennings seems like the guy who could kind of step up here, but I want to see him have a decent game before I actually throw him into my lineup. If you're super desperate, I get it. Could be the wide receiver 2 here, but in the short term, I prefer to wait and see. And then for the Rams, this is tough. This was an offense I was excited about heading into the year. I liked Matthew Stafford as a later round quarterback because he had these 2 stud weapons in Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp. Puka goes down week 1, and it's like, all right, that sucks. But at least like now, Cooper Kupp's going to be a monster. He's going to ball out. He's going to return to his 2021, 2022 form. And now Cooper Kupp is out after week 2. Seems like he's also going to miss some time here. It's not just like a day-to-day thing. So now we're looking at a very, very gross wide receiver room here. We have Demarcus Robinson, Tyler Johnson, Jordan Whittington, and Tutu Atwell. Now, I don't think this usage is like set in stone here, but this is kind of like what we were looking at least in terms like when Cooper Kupp left. So you had Demarcus Robinson, who was playing a full-time starting wide receiver role. He was playing that role heading into week 2. He continued, being a top option once Cooper Kupp left. Then you had Jordan Whittington, who filled into the Cooper Kupp role. So Cooper Kupp left with injury. Jordan Whittington just stepped up, played the Cooper Kupp snaps. You had Tyler Johnson, who played a role in week 1 due to the injury to Puka Nacua. And then he was still like operating as the wide receiver 3, but you had Tutu Atwell kind of filtering into his opportunities. So at this point, I'd consider the top 2 to be Demarcus Robinson. He'd be my favorite pick as number 1. And then Whittington would be my second guy. I guess Tyler Johnson would be 3rd, and then Tutu Atwell kind of filtering in as like a 4th. There's no guarantee that sticks or is the same here moving into week 3. But for this specific matchup, I want to sit all these dudes. I want to see what the usage is. I want to see who's heavily targeted. And just in a bad matchup where you have just a broken down wide receiver room, the offensive line is also, kind of in shambles at this point. This could just be a really rough offensive performance. So would prefer to avoid all these guys going up against the Niners. Now looking at the Chiefs-Falcons game, for the Chiefs, we saw another big Rashee Rice game. He's looking like a smash pick. I will say, heading into the year, I was very, very high on Xavier Worthy. I might have been the highest on him out of like anyone I saw in terms of like any rankings out there. But I will say I was a little bit cautious heading into week 2. And it's just because I felt like the floor was very, very low. I know he had the huge week 1. It was fun to see. I was very excited. He had the touchdown run. He had the broken coverage touchdown reception. But I still thought, the targets weren't necessarily commanded in week 1. I'm not worried long term, but in the short term, it's not like he's this high floor, high ceiling guy. His range of outcomes is very, very high. He could go off, score multiple touchdowns, have a bunch of big plays, or he could do pretty much nothing. And unfortunately, we saw kind of like the floor option in week 2. I'm not worried long term. I think the Hollywood Brown injury with him being out, for the whole regular season, that's massive for Xavier Worthy because like this is his time. He'll figure it out. He'll settle in. But early on, I don't think he's as like set it and forget it as some people were thinking after the big week 1. Now, looking at the Falcons here, I think, I'm cautiously optimistic with what we saw. I don't think Kirk looked great. I think he looked kind of rough until that final drive. The weapons were not necessarily being supported. But, the final drive kind of saved things, especially for Drake London, who was going to have like a not so great day, ends up having a pretty solid fantasy performance. I do think Kirk looked better. He looked a little bit more mobile. They were at least running play action, which we saw literally none of in week one. So hopefully he's still kind of settling in here. Will continue to improve. I still like Drake London. This has never been a talent issue for London. It has only been a quarterback play issue. And I do think he's in a somewhat fun spot in the sense that, like, if other quarterbacks are just bad, most teams are screwed. If Kirk Cousins does not play well and this team thinks they can be competitive, he at least has some upside in the backup with Michael Penix, who's going to be better than pretty much every other backup in the NFL in terms of supporting fantasy weapons, or at least that's what we can hope for. So I like Drake London as a start. Hopefully we see Kirk continuing to look good. And then for Darnell Mooney, had a decent fantasy day, but just not really someone I actually want to be throwing into my lineup. I feel like he's going to have a few big performances, but not someone who's going to be able to, string together impressive games. Now, looking at the Jaguars Bills matchup here, for the Jaguars, I'm starting Brian Thomas Jr. He's been solid through 2 weeks, had the nice week 1, 4 for 47 and a touchdown. Week 2, didn't go crazy in the volume department, but had a couple of big plays. I just think he's their top dog. I think he's going to continue to pull away, and I think he's going to be a nice, like at the very least, wide receiver 2 from this point on. And then for the Bills here, it's tough to trust any of these dudes. Keon Coleman is getting the routes. He had decent volume week 1 compared to the number of pass attempts, but he was pretty much a non-factor. Still running routes, but pretty much just getting his cardio in. Obviously, it was a run-heavy game. James Cook kind of dominated. But at this point, I don't really want to be relying on any of these Bills wide receivers. And then we're going to have the Commanders taking on the Bengals. I believe this is the final game of the week here. For the Commanders, I actually went with Terry McLaurin as a sit. As much as that sucks, I wouldn't trust Terry McLaurin in my lineup. His upside just seems so unbelievably capped. Through 2 weeks, he has 8 receptions for 39 yards on 12 targets. They are not driving the ball down the field. The volume is not even there. Keep in mind, this is not a Terry McLaurin issue. It has never been a Terry McLaurin issue. It is just always the offenses he's in, the quarterback play, and it's not looking great early on. Jane Daniels could improve. Terry McLaurin could get more and more involved in this offense. But with what we've seen through 2 weeks, I'm not interested. And this is a very different situation than like trying to think of someone else who's maybe dudded 2 weeks in a row. Like a Tank Dell, right? Tank Dell at least has the offense where it seems like he could go for a boom game in week 3, pretty much at any point. For Terry McLaurin, that doesn't seem super likely, just given the current state of this Commanders offense. And then for the Bengals here, Jamar Chase is obviously a start. We'll continue to monitor the T. Higgins injury, but tough to see him being a super reliable option. Andre Yoshivas, I think he scored 2 touchdowns in that game. I guess if you're super desperate, maybe he's playable. I wouldn't love it. It seems like he's a solid red zone threat, but not someone who's consistently winning on other portions of the field. Decent matchup here against the Commanders. Fun matchup, but Jamar Chase would really be the guy I want to bank on here. And that is going to wrap it up for all 16 Week 3 wide receiver matchups. If you guys have any questions, you can drop them down below. Check out the running back video if you haven't already. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.